is Will Potter. I'm a journalist based in Washington, D.C. I'm also the author of Green is the New Red, which is a book about how animal rights activists and environmentalists are being labeled as terrorists by the government. I became interested in the issue of repression of the animal rights movement through my personal relationships with some of the people that have been most affected. I have a background in journalism, of course, but also in political activism in the animal rights and environmental movements. And I was watching some very close friends of mine being persecuted for their beliefs and their activism. At the same time, I also had my own experiences being visited by the FBI and threatened with being put on a domestic terrorist list simply because I was handing out leaflets in a neighborhood. And that was really a turning point for me. It was a terrifying experience to be approached by the FBI in that way, but after my fear went away, I really became obsessed with finding out how animal rights activists who have not harmed anyone could be labeled as terrorists. When I began writing about these issues, the focus was on illegal underground groups, such as the Animal Liberation Front and Earth Liberation Front, also groups like Earth First. Over the years, that's radically expanded so that the people that are most affected now are the above ground, lawful, mainstream organizations, people who are doing things like photographing animal abuse on factory farms. This is a change that when I began working on these issues 15 years ago, I never would have thought possible. I mean, it's literally targeting the most public and nonviolent activists, and I think it shows the desperation of this industry. There's a direct relationship between the repression coming from the government and the business interests who are being protested. In all levels of government in the United States in particular, there's a heavy influence by corporations as they give money to politicians, they help finance political campaigns. But in my research, I've also found out about corporations sitting down with the police and instructing them how to prosecute activists, meeting with the FBI, meeting with members of Congress, taking out advertisements urging prosecutions of political activists. In other words, at every single level of this repression, these corporations have been intimately involved. Ag-gag laws are relatively new attempts to criminalize undercover investigations of factory farms and animal abuse. They refer to ag as in agriculture, and gag means to silence, because these are attempts to silence people who are exposing what these industries are doing. They've been passed in several states already. Last year was in Iowa, Utah, and Missouri, and recently they've been introduced in more than a dozen states. This is a trend that unfortunately I don't think is going away. There's already been one person prosecuted under Utah's ag-gag law, and she was filming a slaughterhouse from the public street. So not only was she was not an undercover investigator, she was not being secret, she was standing on the street filming, and even that is being prosecuted. For a long time, the response of the animal rights movement was really two different things. One was to have macho posturing, to pretend that none of this mattered, that nobody was afraid, that we couldn't have time to focus on these issues because it was detracting attention from animal activism. Then it began shifting into fear as people became more and more afraid of these tactics and the possibility of being prosecuted as terrorism. I would argue right now we're entering a third phase as people are more aware of these issues and they're also angry and fighting back against it. We're seeing an increased attention on ag-gag laws, on civil liberties across the country and internationally, on surveillance, and there's really been a drastic change in how these topics are being discussed. There's also been a rapid increase in activism. Undercover investigators are exposing these industries like never before. Environmentalists are using nonviolent civil disobedience to protest the Keystone Pipeline and the logging of old-growth forests. I mean, this is an inspirational level of activism despite the repression. I think it's important to remember that this repression is not going away. I don't say that to make us feel fatalistic or that change is impossible. On the contrary, I think it should be inspirational to realize that this is all happening because activists have been so effective at threatening corporate profits. And as they grow more and more effective every day, the repression is going to continue. That doesn't mean that we are powerless in how we respond to it. In my work, I hope people are able to learn from other eras of government repression, and also to look very critically at what is happening today, right now, so we can learn from it immediately and evolve our response and be more effective in our activism. It's difficult to say the exact consequences of how this is affecting activists and journalists right now, simply because people are constantly trying to figure out how to navigate this and how to deal with this new legislation. I mean, the activism has not stopped. The undercover investigations have not stopped. But there is a growing concern of how these laws will be used and how people will be investigated. I mean, personally speaking as a journalist, I'm increasingly concerned as I've seen my own work being monitored by the counterterrorism unit. The FBI is claiming that I'm part of a current law enforcement investigation. It's incredibly troubling to see these developments, but we have to keep doing our work. The only option is to move forward and to keep doing what we're doing. For a long time, there was no response from other movements and from the general public to this persecution of animal rights and environmental activists. I think other social movements viewed it as something that was simply happening to other people, that it didn't immediately affect them. Now we're seeing that changing. Particularly with ag-gag laws, we're seeing a dramatic change in how other social movements are viewing what's happening. I've seen an unprecedented coalition of environmental groups, animal protection groups, mainstream animal protection groups, workers' rights groups and unions, civil liberties groups, all working together. Even with groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, this repression is being viewed as a human rights and civil rights issue as well. And I think that allows for an unprecedented opportunity to build stronger coalitions, to come together and learn from other movements, and to move forward together.